So at the moment I'm not as busy with orders because of the coronavirus. A lot of my customers have postponed their cakes. I still have a few, but as I'm not as busy, I thought I would do a few tutorials for you, give you some tips and tricks, because I know a lot of you are trying to keep the kids entertained and bake at home and, you know, keep up the morale. So while I'm making buttercream today and tomorrow, I'm going to make a few videos with a few tips and tricks for you to tell you the difference between the different types of buttercream. So you know when I say, oh, I'm using this type with my cakes, or this type when I'm putting cupcakes up for sale, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And also, it'll be easier if you're baking. If you're a baker and there's a few questions that you had, maybe I can answer them in this, you know, this little video thing that I'm doing. So I'm actually going to make American buttercream. American buttercream is the most simple one to make. It's just butter and icing sugar. That is it. There's a few different methods you could use that add milk or hot water or cream or chocolate. Everyone has different methods that they use to get the best, smoothest buttercream. This is the buttercream that has the chance of going grainy on you because you've added too much sugar in. You're using a really grainy type of icing sugar. Maybe you're not beating your butter for long enough, so it's not able to really absorb and soak in all your icing sugar, so it's left being a bit grainy. You're not mixing it for long enough. So I'm going to show you how to make it, and while I'm going through it, I'm going to explain how you can overcome the really normal problems, and hopefully give you some tips and tricks that make it a little bit smoother for you to make the next time that you do make it. So first of all, one thing that comes with experience is knowing the difference between these two instruments to use when you're making your buttercream. Honestly, there's no wrong one if you want to use a whisk for your butter, because what you're going to do is you want to try and get your butter as light and fluffy as possible before you add your icing sugar. It's going to give you that volume, it's going to give you that smoothness, and it's going to be a lot easier for your icing sugar to be incorporated into the mixture for you to have a really nice, smooth American buttercream. Right, so you can start with a whisk. If you use a whisk attachment with your butter and you also then use it when you're once you've put your icing sugar in, you're going to get a lot of air into your mixture. So if you're using it for an outside coat of your cake, then it's not ideal because you do get a lot of air bubbles in it. You can also use a paddle attachment. A paddle attachment will give you the volume but not as much air inside. I tend to use the whisk attachment to mix my butter. Once it's nice and light and fluffy and it's gone from a yellowy colour to a more white cream colour, I'll switch over to the paddle attachment, and then I'll add my icing sugar and my flavouring, and then I'll mix it on a medium to slow speed for about 10 minutes, and that gives it the time to be incorporated. It gives it time to be incorporated into the butter. It doesn't knock out all of the air, but it also doesn't add any more air to your mixture. So if you're using it for an outside coat of your cake, you're not going to get lots of air bubbles, you're not going to get lots of dragging on the outside of your coat. Now, I only use American buttercream really inside my cakes because I find it a little bit sweet. I find to get the right balance of buttercream, I use Swiss meringue buttercream outside and American buttercream inside. American buttercream is quite sturdy. You can make it a lot more dense. I find that it's perfect for in between the layers of cakes, especially really tall cakes. It gives you a really nice strong foundation to work with, so your cakes aren't going to lean or collapse. So what I'm going to do first of all, this buttercream that I'm making is just for the family. It's not for a customer or anything at the moment. So what I'm going to use is 4 blocks of unsalted butter. Now some people like to use a bit of the wrapping there. Some people like to use salted butter. You can use salted butter. It's really good in American buttercream because it cuts through the sweetness of the buttercream and it gives it a really nice balance. There's nothing worse than when someone's made a cake and they haven't thought about the balance of the cake. They make a really beautiful sponge, which tastes great, and then they make a really good filling, which tastes great, and then they make a really great buttercream, and they layer it all together, and what they haven't taken into account is every layer has its own sweetness that is adding to the final cake, and you can get a really, really overly sweet cake. So by putting some salt in, or salted butter, you cut through that sweetness and you give your cake a really nice balance. When you go for more expensive and bespoke cakes, you taste the buttercream and it tastes a little bit different and you're not sure what it is, and it's normally because they've got salt in it, because when you pay for a more expensive cake, you're paying for someone to care about the balance of the flavours and the balance of the sweetness in it. I wouldn't recommend using all salted butter because it can be salt overkill and it ends up being like a little bit tangy. So half and half salted salted butter and unsalted butter is fine. Or if you want to add a pinch of salt to flavour once you've finished mixing everything up. So this is 1 kilo of butter that I've got in here, unsalted butter. I'm now going to add approximately 2 kilos of icing sugar once this is whipped up. As a general rule of thumb, you want half the amount of butter, then you have icing sugar, and this will give you a nice thick crusting buttercream. This means that when it sets on the outside, it will form a firm crust. It's great for piping, especially decorations, or the outer layer on a bespoke cake. So I've got my trusty Kenwood. This is actually older than me. It had a new motor in it, I think 4 years ago. This is about 30 plus years old, so I'm going to go in with my whisk attachment. Now, it's good to have your butter at room temperature or slightly warmer, and this is why. When you whip it up, it's going to make it a lot easier to whip. Also, if you think about it, it's a lot easier for the sugar to be incorporated and to dissolve into a warmer mixture. When a mixture is warmer, it can absorb more. When it's colder, it won't absorb more. So if you get that really nice smooth finish, you don't want it to be runny. I have on occasion warmed up half the butter and it is a little bit runny. And sometimes you do get really good buttercream when the butter is quite warm, but you don't want it to be really soft, because when you're whipping it up, you're not going to get the volume that you want because it's too runny and it's too wet and it's too oily, and you've got the milk parts that's separated from the fat inside the butter. You can turn this on, and I'm going to put it on high for about 10 minutes. I generally leave it, so I'll let it run for a minute or two, scrape down the bowl, and then leave it for about 7 to 10 minutes, and then come back to it. Just forget about it. Leave it on high and forget about it. And when you come back, it's going to look like whipped cream. It's going to look really silky and really gorgeous. So I've left my mixer on for about 10 minutes. I think I scraped it down 3 times. This is what it should look like. Whoa. Excuse my mixer. So this is what it should look like. It's a little bit greasy. Let's take the whisk off. Hopefully it focuses. This is what it should look like, nice and fluffy. And as you can see, I'm hoping, can you see all the air bubbles and the tiny pockets? These are the air bubbles that will cause problems once you've put your icing sugar in, if you've got too much air in your mixture. And then you continue with the whisk. You want to continue with the paddle now to get rid of those tiny air bubbles, but keep the volume. If you keep mixing with the whisk, you're going to keep adding air in and keep the same amount of air and not get a smooth finish. And it's so difficult to tell if there's air bubbles or not inside your American buttercream until you start smoothing it on the cake, unless you've really given it a good mix after it's come out of the mixer to try and get rid of some of the air. So I've got this really big bag of icing sugar. First of all, I'm going to add some vanilla. And then I'm going to eyeball how much icing sugar I need. I've never sifted my icing sugar. So approximately, we want 4 of these bowls. I'm going to add half in first, because as you can see, it creates like a snowstorm of sugar. And it will end up all over your kitchen. You'll have this really thin layer of icing sugar over absolutely everything, and it's a nightmare to get rid of. So we switched over the attachment to the padded attachment. We've got our butter in, we've got our icing sugar, and we have got our vanilla. So you might want to take a clean tea towel, place it over the top, and then you can either pulse it. Ooh. You can either pulse it or put it on low for a moment until the icing sugar is incorporated and not going to create loads of dust. As you can see, it's just rising off of the tea towel as well. So you'll still get a little bit of icing sugar everywhere, but not as much. There are a lot of mixers that have like a shield, so you don't get icing sugar everywhere, but mine's very old school. So I'm not sure if you can see. I'm just trying to lift this up. That's what it looks like. Now I can still see the lumps of icing sugar in here. It's not something that I'm concerned about, because I leave it on to mix for so long that all the lumps end up smoothing out. That being said, different icing sugars that you get from different companies will be grainier than others, and a lot more lumpy than others, depending on how they're packaged. They can be packaged in a way that moisture gets in, and once that moisture gets into the packet, that's what makes it really hard and rocky inside, because the icing sugar's got a little bit moist. So I'm going to mix this on medium high. I'm trying to show you something as well. A little tip that I learned. Oh my god, this mixer's so heavy. So if you can see, I'll turn it this way. I'm hoping that you can see. My mixer is fully submerged inside my buttercream. I always make batches that are going to be bigger in volume than the actual paddle attachment. Because the whole paddle attachment is submerged, it's only going to mix. It's not going to incorporate any more air. So you're going to get a really smooth finish. If your paddle attachment is just above where your buttercream is, as it's all mixing in, you're actually mixing in air as well. You won't get the tiny little bubbles, but you will still get a lot of air in your mixture, which is ideally you don't want. You want a really nice smooth finish. Unless you're going for like a dessert cake or something that's a little bit more rustic, you want really smooth buttercream. That is always the aim with buttercream, smooth buttercream. You start with smooth buttercream. Even if you want to end up with a nice textured cake, you want smooth buttercream to create a textured cake, even if it's ruffles. So I'm going to leave this to mix for a minute, and then I'm going to add the rest of the icing sugar in. Then I'm going to leave it on a medium for about 7 to 10 minutes. I leave my buttercream to run for a really long time, and I always know that because my mixer gets quite hot. It's getting a little bit old. But you want to leave it to mix for as long as possible. The longer that your ingredients have to fully incorporate with each other, the smoother the buttercream you have. How many times have I said smooth? So I'm just going to turn this off, but as you can see, it's really nice and fluffy. I've only added in half of my icing. Really nice and fluffy. You can't see any lumps, even though my icing sugar was lumpy. I didn't sift it in. You can quite clearly see these tiny little pockets. Those are the tiny air bubbles that when you smooth your cake like this are going to show through. So we're going to add a little bit more icing sugar, and then we're going to leave it to mix on really low, and then I'm going to show you what I do to get it really, really smooth. Just to show you, these are some of the lumps that go into my icing sugar. I don't sift it at all. When I began baking, I took on a lot of people's tips and tricks, and then as I continued my journey baking, I tried to cut down time a little bit and to work out what was best for me. And one of the things that I used to hate was sifting icing sugar. I used to find it such a waste of time, and it was so tedious. But I find that if you just beat your icing sugar for a long period of time on medium to low, then you will find that you have no lumps in your icing sugar. As long as you've got the right proportions, you will have no lumps in your icing sugar. It will be smooth. Nobody got time for that? Right, I'm going to put this back over. I'm also going to add a tiny bit of salt. I don't know if you can see how much that is. I'm going to get mixing here. Second time round, when you add the final part of icing sugar, generally that's when you get the most amount of mess, because the volume in your bowl has increased. There's a lot more icing sugar that's around the rim as well if you haven't got a shield to protect your bowl and your kitchen and yourself from the icing sugar storms. So you want to pulse it ideally so that it doesn't all fall around the edge. I'll tell you something funny. My mixer has had a new motor in it, and I don't know what supersonic turbo mixer that engine, whatever it's called, they've put in it, motor they've put in it. This is number, so it goes up to number 10 is the maximum. This is number 1, number 2, it's number 3. Right, it's okay. So it's very, very thick now. I'm just gonna push all of the icing around the rim into the mixture. Just go around the edge as well. You can get something called a flexi beater for Kenwoods, and it goes over this, and it means that you don't have to scrape down the edges. But I've got a spatula. I can't justify paying £20 or £30 for an attachment. Spend all my extra money on stencils and food colouring. And it's still quite lumpy now. So this is what my buttercream looks like after, I'd say, about 4 minutes. Look at that! And you saw the size of the lumps that I had in my buttercream. It really, really baffles me when people get American buttercream wrong. It's the most simple buttercream to do. It's so rewarding. Look how silky smooth that is. You know, I see people do so much. I've sifted the icing sugar twice. I've made sure that the butter is at precisely this temperature. I mixed at this speed for this long, and they're still getting it wrong. Can you see? You still got the tiny air bubbles, but nowhere near as much as you had before. So when you are smoothing this out, you're going to get a nice clean finish like this. This isn't quite a crusting buttercream. I haven't added as much icing sugar as I can do if I want to make really detailed stiff flowers, but you will still get a nice structure for the inside of a cake. It will be good for the outside of a cake if you've got minimal decoration on it, because you don't want it to be too heavy, the decoration, or overload the cake, because it isn't as stiff as a crusting buttercream, which is the stiffest.